What I have here are 3 different Franklin computers. One of these was donated to me about a year ago, and the other 2 are borrowed. These have a really fascinating history, and if you're thinking to yourself that you've never seen one of these, then you're probably wrong. The Franklin Ace was clearly visible in the 1984 movie Ghostbusters, and if you've never seen Ghostbusters, then you need to stop watching this video right now and go watch it because it's one of my all-time favorite movies. It was also seen in Revenge of the Nerds in the form of a poster on the wall.
Now, whether you've ever used one of these or not, the sheer existence of this computer has probably affected you and everyone else on the planet, at least in some small way, because the lawsuit surrounding this product essentially defined computer copyright law as we know it today, which we'll circle back to in a little bit.
Franklin was probably better known for their line of handheld products that resembled little computers, but typically just ran a single application, such as a dictionary, spell checker, a language translator, Rolodexes, or even the Holy Bible. There's so many of these that I can't even count, probably hundreds of variations. They even invented the Rex, which is a little PDA that fit inside of a PCMCI slot on a laptop computer of the era, although this was later bought out by Zircom. But for this episode, we'll be focusing on the Franklin Ace series, which were meant to be compatible with software for the Apple II and II Plus. Franklin often used advertisements like these with a person dressed like Benjamin Franklin. The first product in the line was the Franklin Ace 100, which first appeared in early 1982, which I do not have a real version on hand to show, but that's okay. I don't think very many of these were made, probably just a few thousand. These were almost like prototypes for what was to come later, the Franklin Ace 1000. The 1000 was released just a couple of months later in a much sleeker case. As I show off the various features of the Ace 1000, I just wanted to remind everyone that this was March of 1982, years before the Apple IIe or IIc, and even several months before the Commodore 64 came to market. So, looking at the Ace 1000, you may notice that it is clearly larger than the Apple II Plus, and with it, I also have an original Franklin green monochrome monitor. And while Franklin did eventually produce a color monitor years later, during the early years, this was probably the only offering. Of course, it's just a standard composite monitor, although it does have this bizarre 40 or 80 character switch on the back. I can't figure out what the switch does. It seems to simply change the width of the screen slightly. Other than that, I can't see any difference. Now, while you could obviously use any composite monitor with it, this monitor was a pretty good fit because, believe it or not, unlike the Apple II Plus, these computers generally didn't output color. So a monochrome monitor was a good fit, as at least the text would be sharper. So let's take a look at the keyboard. The arrangement is a bit different from an Apple II Plus, and one super obvious improvement was the addition of a number pad, something Apple wouldn't offer for several more years later. However, there is one very welcome improvement. Notice the location of the cursor keys up here like this? At first glance, you may not realize why this is brilliant. Well, remember on the Apple II, the cursor keys are here, and there is no delete or backspace key. You were expected to use the left cursor to back up. Even on later Apple II models where they added a delete key, it didn't actually work in BASIC, instead printing this annoying checkerbox pattern on the screen. So since Apple's operating system did not support having a proper backspace key, Franklin put the cursor keys up here so that the left cursor is exactly where you'd expect the backspace key to be. And you know, it works out pretty well. This isn't the only computer like this. The Osborne also used a similar concept, even though it was not an Apple II clone. And the Osborne had just come out a year before this, so it's possible they got the idea from that, but who knows. Also, there is no obvious reset button anywhere on the keyboard, which struck me as odd at first, as that's sort of an essential button on an Apple II. Well, it turns out it's hidden underneath the keyboard here. Kind of weird, actually, but as you can see, it works as expected. Anyway, the last thing I want to mention about the keyboard is the presence of the shift lock key. The Apple II had no such thing, and had no need of such thing because it could only display uppercase characters anyway. Well, Franklin added lowercase character set, which you could enable by turning off the shift lock key, which, by the way, defaulted to on at power up, as to mimic the behavior of the Apple II. So, as you can see, they did make a few improvements here. Of course, later Apple II models did include lowercase characters. Okay, so let's take this thing apart and have a look inside. The top is simply held on by these 2 thumb levers, and it pops off relatively easily, like so. Before we look at the motherboard, let's look at some of these cards. This is the floppy controller card. As you can see, it can support 2 disk drives, just like Apple's own controller. However, it has a lot more components on board than Apple's, which we'll talk about further here in a bit. The next card is the 80 column card. It's very similar to the aftermarket cards available for the Apple II systems of the era. As you can see, the video output comes directly out of the card, and then there are these other two wires which pipe the standard 40 column and graphics mode video through the card. And the card can switch to whichever video needs to be output. So with the card removed, you can use the standard composite output on the back of the motherboard here for regular 40 column mode. Okay, and this last card, well, honestly, I have no idea what this is. My guess is some sort of serial or parallel card, but if you know, let me know in the comments. Now that we can see the board clearly, let me show you something that is missing. There's a bunch of unpopulated parts here, and this is where the cassette interface would go. Notice the two larger connectors are labeled C in and C out. My guess is by 1982, the Apple II platform was dominated by disk drives, and thus the cassette feature was just sort of pointless. Well, to get a better look at the motherboard, let's take the top case off. It just has a few screws on the bottom, then as you can see, it just lifts right off. I just need to unplug the keyboard, and there we go. So looking at the board, I'm not going to go over every component as that would take forever. Suffice it to say, here's a standard 6502 CPU, 64K of RAM, which was good because most Apples of the era only had 48K, unless they had a language card installed. And then there's 12K of system ROM, all of which is copied directly from Apple, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But what is this giant daughter card here? Well, it turns out this is an option card which would give the Franklin color output. It's ridiculously complex compared to the method Steve Wozniak used for color output on the Apple II. So why is that? Well, it's the same story as the floppy controller we looked at earlier. Certain aspects of the Apple II hardware design were patented and could not be copied. So they had to design components to do the same job without infringing on those patents. Anyway, so without this card, your Franklin would be monochrome only, which was probably fine for a lot of people, especially business users who were more interested in the 80 column output, which was monochrome by design anyway. So let's fire this thing up and try a few pieces of software. I have here several Apple II games. Let's do this one. As you can see, it boots just fine. This is one of the more famous games on the platform. Let's try another one. This is Sticky Bear. It's an educational or edutainment product. It just shows a bunch of animations to help kids learn words. And yep, it works just fine too. But wait, will it run Petsky Robots? This is actually a question that needs to be answered, and I'll explain why shortly. But as you can see, it does appear to work just fine. I even played it for a few minutes and confirmed everything works. Now, why did this need to be answered? Well, if you look at the user's manual for the Apple II version of the game, it states all of the machines that should be compatible. And notice that it says Franklin Ace, untested, but should be compatible. At the time, I didn't have access to one of these, so I couldn't guarantee it would work. But now we know, it works fine. Okay, so let's try some other stuff, like running a basic program. I wrote this little Kaleidoscope program a while back for another video, and as you can see, it has no trouble running that same program here, which is no surprise because they copied Apple's ROM, which includes BASIC as well. Okay, so now I want to take a look at the included productivity software. We have AceCalc and AceWriter. Now you can tell that AceWriter got a lot of use by the original owner based on the discoloration of the label where the thumb would go to pull the disk out, probably hundreds of times. In fact, AceWriter no longer reads correctly, but AceCalc works fine, so let's have a look at that. When we start up, we get this menu. I'm going to go to the disk subsystem and catalog the disk. Yep, there's some example spreadsheets I can load. So I'll go to load spreadsheet. This is actually pretty user-friendly for the era. I can just pick the file I want by the number along the left side. It asks if it's okay to erase the current spreadsheet. And here we go. And we're running this in 40 columns right now. And the crazy thing is, this machine has 80 columns ability, but I prefer the 40 column spreadsheet, and I'll show you why. To enable 80 columns, you go to the configuration system and pick a video slot. I know my 80 column card is in slot 3, so I'll go ahead and pick that slot. And there we have it. I have 80 columns. The font is kind of weird looking with some streaky horizontal lines, and the reverse text is just absolutely blown out. I thought maybe this phenomenon was just the monitor, but I tried my Tandy monitor and the text looked exactly the same. So you might think I just need to turn the brightness or contrast down, but that doesn't actually help any at all. So then you might think it's that weird 40-80 column switch on the back of the monitor, but nope. I actually have two of these Franklin 80 column cards and both have the same behavior. So I'm a bit confused unless they need new capacitors or something. Speaking of bad video, let's go back to that color add-on card I talked about earlier. So I have a color television here and an Apple IIc and a Franklin Ace on either side. So we're going to do a little switcheroo to compare video quality. The first thing I want you to see is text mode. The Franklin appears to work like the very early Apple II computers that had no color killer for the text mode. So basically, it's always outputting color all the time, even in text mode. I wouldn't say the text is unreadable, but it is certainly hard to look at. Now, switching video cables to the Apple IIc, you'll see the same screen, much easier to read, although I don't know why the text is flashing here, that's odd. But you get the idea. Text mode sucks on a color monitor with the Franklin. So what about some color graphics? Okay, let's do a little swap here. Can you tell the difference? If you can't, don't feel bad. For some reason, the camera isn't really picking up the difference, and I can't tell why. I mean, you can see a little difference, but this isn't really showing what it looks like in person. So instead, I used a video capture device, and this does a much better job of showing the difference. So here's the Apple IIc, now the Franklin. Bet you can see the difference now. Here's another example. And another. So yeah, color just isn't great on the Franklin, period. Okay, we've covered the Ace 1000 pretty well. Let's move on to its sibling, the Ace 1200. Now, as you can see, it looks quite a bit different, the most notable difference being the built-in dual disk drives. And while the keyboards look identical at first glance, there are a few differences I've noticed. The big one for me is how the keys feel. The 1000 keys are squishy, kind of like an original Apple II Plus. But the 1200 keys feel really nice, more like the keyboard of an Apple IIe Platinum. You can even hear the difference. The other difference is the numpad. You can see on the 1200 there's some extra labeling for cursor keys and things like format, insert, delete, etc. The 1000 on the other hand looks very plain. But now I'm going to show you the key difference between these computers by simply removing the lids. Okay, here's the lid off the 1000. And with the 1200 I need to disconnect the floppy cables, but after that I think you'll see the magic here. These computers are essentially the same. They have the same bottom case, power supply, and motherboard. The main difference is the top cover. So looking inside the 1200, you'll see we have a floppy controller, 80-column card, and a CP/M card. The 1200 was often marketed more as a business machine. In fact, as you can see in this advertisement for the 1200, again with Benjamin Franklin as the spokesman, they say, "The Ace 1200 is hardware and software compatible with the Apple II, and with the built-in CP/M card, you can run both Apple II and CP/M programs." CP/M had its heyday in the 1970s, but was still in use a lot during the 80s, especially in the business world. The Franklin Ace 1200 was introduced in 1983, so that was towards the end of CP/M's life, at least from a standpoint of any new software development, so I'm not sure how lucrative that was at the time, but who knows. So having a closer look at the CP/M card, it does have a built-in Z80 processor, and it has its own 64K of RAM as well, so it doesn't actually use any of the RAM in the Franklin for executing programs. CP/M was the native operating system of quite a few computers like the Osborne, Kaypro, MSI, Eagle, and the Altair 8080, just to name a few. In fact, if you look at Wikipedia, the list of computers that either ran CP/M software natively or could run it with an add-on card is quite extensive. And while all of these machines were software compatible with each other, the disk formats were not. So you couldn't take a disk from an Osborne and put it into a Kaypro and expect it to read it. So instead of having a single disk that would work on multiple computers, typically CP/M software had to be converted to multiple disk formats, and when mail ordering a disk, you would have to specify what type of computer you had in order to receive a compatible disk. As such, I can't just stick any old CP/M disk in the Franklin and expect it to work. It needs to be formatted just for the Apple-style disk drives. Fortunately, I managed to find a few disk images on the internet that would work, so I'll boot the computer with the CP/M boot disk. It doesn't take long and it switches to 80 columns, and we're at the A prompt. There's not a lot on the system disk to mess around with, but one disk I managed to find was Zork. In fact, this disk has Zork 1 and 2 on it.
For you text adventure aficionados, Zork. Pick me, I'm fun.
Anyway, as you can see, it works fine. Although this is sort of pointless because there is a native Apple II version that would run just fine on this computer, but if you had a dedicated CP/M machine, you would have to run this version. Another program I found was WordStar. However, it doesn't work so well, and it's nothing to do with the CP/M compatibility, but that pesky problem with the 80-column card in this computer. It just makes large portions of the program unreadable. However, I'm sure when this stuff was new, the card probably worked fine, and this software would have been very usable. So, the Ace 1200 was sort of the premier version of the Franklin at the time. I can certainly see why some businesses or schools would prefer this more industrial, beefy, all-in-one design over even an official Apple II. But things were about to take a rough turn at Franklin. In 1982, Apple took Franklin to court over copyright infringement. After all, the ROMs are almost identical other than the intro screen text, which had been changed to say Ace 1000 v2.2. However, Franklin outright admitted to using Apple's code, and they made the case that it was legal to build a compatible system, but because so much software existed that called various entry point vectors in the ROM code, that it would be nearly impossible to write a fully compatible ROM on their own. The court actually sided with Franklin at first, but Apple took it to appeals court, and fortunately for them, it was the same court that had recently ruled on the case of Williams Electronics versus Arctic International. Arctic was selling clones of the arcade game Defender and had copied Williams' ROM code. The court had sided with Williams, setting some precedent for how to handle the Franklin case. Apple emerged victorious, and Franklin was ordered to stop using Apple ROM.
So, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this case actually helped define many of the modern laws that we have regarding copyright of computer code. It is likely that anyone who has ever used a computer has been affected, at least in some small way, by the outcome of this case.
And by the way, a few years later, the Laser 128 came to market, which did in fact have a fully reverse-engineered ROM code, thus making it immune from Apple's lawsuits. I did a whole documentary on these if you haven't seen it yet. But anyway, clearly Franklin was wrong when they said it wouldn't be possible to do that. One of Franklin's attempts to get around this was by a redesign of the motherboard. So what I have here is another Franklin Ace 1000, which on the outside looks exactly the same, but let's take a look at the inside of both of them. So, on the left, we have the one you've already seen, and notice it has a disk controller card, but the new unit has an integrated disk controller. Also, on the previous unit, notice it has 6 ROM chips, but in the newer one, there's only a single ROM chip and 3 unpopulated ROM areas.
So what Franklin did was what the courts told them to do, remove the infringing code from ROM, so they instead moved that infringing code over to a floppy disk.
So how this would work was very similar to the Kickstart disk used by the Amiga 1000. You're essentially loading the ROM from the disk and placing it into RAM. Then, after that's loaded, you can change the disk to some other boot disk or game or whatever. In fact, I have the user's manual here, and you'll notice it actually says you must load FDOS from your FDOS diskette every time you turn the power on.
Okay, so I'm actually a little bit fuzzy on this particular topic. I've done a lot of research, asked a lot of people, but just haven't been able to come up with a definite answer as to whether their new boot disk also contained infringing copies of Apple's ROM code. Best I can tell, it did. And if it did, how that was a legal workaround, I'm not actually sure.
I'd love to show you my system boot up because then maybe I could answer some of that, but as you can see, mine has a problem I haven't been able to solve. Actually, 2 problems. The first is this weird video display duplication issue. I suspect there's a problem with the video RAM decoding logic somewhere. The other problem is my FDOS disk is no good anymore and no longer reads, and I've not been able to find a copy of it online or in any user groups.
Whether or not it was infringing on Apple or legal workaround or not, apparently consumers didn't like having to boot from the boot disk before being able to boot from anything else. So apparently they were very unpopular and they did not sell well. And that's probably why nobody has a working boot disk that I've been able to track down. So naturally, now that I've released the video, I'm sure there's going to be 100 people raising their hands going, I have the boot disk, I have it. And that's fine. Please don't email me trying to send me the boot disk. I actually don't even need it at this point. My request would be, if you do have the boot disk, see if you can get a proper image of it and get it uploaded to someplace like archive.org so that everybody else has access to it.
After the lawsuit, Franklin would go on to develop their own cleanroom engineered ROM and produce new computers such as this Ace 2100. Now, there were actually 3 computers in this series, the Ace 2000, which had no floppy drives. I'm not sure why anyone would want this. And then the 2100, which has a single drive, which is what we have here, and then the 2200, which has 2 floppy drives. I was fortunate to get a hold of this 2100 right as I was wrapping up this video, so let's have a closer look. It's actually not very big, about the size of a PC Junior. It has a nice detached keyboard, which, by the way, Apple never produced anything like this until the Apple II GS several years later, but even that didn't have an internal drive. Since this computer is supposed to be compatible with the Apple IIe, they added these 2 F keys here, which are the equivalent to the open and closed Apple keys. They're just in an unusual place. The monitor is a bit yellowed and could probably use some retro bright. So let's boot this thing up to basic and have a look. As far as monochrome monitors go, this thing has a fantastic picture and the screen is almost flat. I figure I'll start off by testing my basic program and see if it works. And it does. Next I'll see about starting up 80 columns and see how that looks. And it looks fantastic. Way better than the previous computers I showed, but again, there was probably something wrong with those 80 column cards. This is how 80 columns is supposed to look. Well, I'll try a few games to see how compatible it is. Here's Wolfenstein. Seems to run just fine. Here's Ghostbusters. I noticed the camera was a bit overexposed, so I turned the brightness down a tad. That's better. Okay, well, might as well try Oregon Trail, and sure enough, it works too. Okay, now I'm going to try a color monitor and see if it produces color any better than the previous units. And it appears we still have that terrible color fringing in text mode, as it doesn't seem to have a color killer. Unless there's a manual option I haven't found yet, but certainly not an automatic one. So you wouldn't want a color monitor for text-based stuff. But let's try some games and see how those look. Okay, well, I mean, it's not terrible, but I think there's still a bit of an oversaturation of color. Maybe not quite as bad as the previous units. And it still doesn't show up well on camera, so you'll just have to take my word for it. How about a game that runs in double high res? I'm curious to see how that looks. Okay, Battle Chess doesn't look too bad. Certainly the double high res mode is compatible, even if the color doesn't look quite as good. But hey, there's a way around all of those color problems. This computer is also equipped with an RGB output. So I'll connect up my Tandy RGBI monitor. Let's power it on and see if it works. And it does. I'll put Sticky Bear in and see how it runs. Okay, looks pretty good. Obviously the colors don't match composite mode since an RGB monitor has a fixed palette, but I think it looks nice. Let's try Pitfall 2. Okay, that looks decent. And of course, we need to try Petsky Robots, not only for the color, but to see if it's compatible with Franklin's custom ROM code. And yep, everything seems to be working fine so far. That is, until I tried displaying the map, which uses double low-res mode. It sort of works, and at least it doesn't crash or anything, but yeah, something's not quite right there. Okay, but what about 80-column text? A good test for that would be AppleWorks. And yep, it does an excellent job at displaying 80-column text in a nice, crisp black and white. So yeah, this would have really been the way to go for having the best of both worlds on your Franklin. But wait, I need one more test. What about a game that runs in double high res? Aha! Houston, we have a problem. There's no color at all. But having looked through the manual, I think there is a solution for this. Let's open this thing up. And we need to go look at the inside anyway. The disk drives themselves are mounted in the top portion, and as you can see, there is room for a second drive if you wanted to upgrade it. But looking at the motherboard, I just wanted to point out a few things. This daughter board here is the RGB card, which I believe is an optional component. But as you can see, the ribbon cable goes out to the RGB port on the back. This is a serial card. Likewise, it's connected to the serial port on the rear. And this appears to be a RAM expansion card. I believe this unit may have 384K, which was a lot at the time, although I'm not sure how much software could take advantage of that. But anyway, there are some jumpers on the RGB card, and I believe one of them has to do with how the double high res is displayed. So I'll move that jumper, and look, there we go. We have full 16 colors now. So anyway, that's the 2000 series. I'm actually really impressed. I never saw one of these back in the day. Franklin would go on to produce other computers like the 5000 and 500. Unfortunately, Franklin would eventually give up on making Apple II compatible computers, but would go on to make a few IBM PC compatible computers such as the PC 6000 and PC 8000. However, apparently these didn't sell well either and are a bit hard to find today. My personal opinion is, I think the early Franklins were pretty good clones of the Apple II Plus, and the 2000 series was probably better than the real thing. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed learning about the Franklin computers, but that's it for this episode. As always, thanks for watching.